Conde Pumpido is preparing a blow against the Constitution to pave the way for Pedro Sánchez. Let's begin. Hello everyone, and welcome to a new edition of Precautionary Measures. Evil never rests, and that's why we're here at Precautionary Measures, to bring you all the information that doesn't appear in the media or on other YouTube channels. Pay attention to what's brewing now in the Constitutional Court, presided over by Candido Conde Pumpido. And as you already know, it simply serves the interests of Pedro Sánchez and the PSOE government. There, pay attention to what the leftist judges of the Constitutional Court are doing right now, with Conde Pumpido at the helm. Because I can already tell you they want to prepare the streets for Pedro Sánchez. Just in case there's an electoral turnaround and the Partido Popular ends up governing with Vox. Stay until the end of the video because you're going to be amazed by this last misdeed. And, as always, we're going to share the information on screen so you can follow along from home. There you have a photograph of Candido Conde Pumpido meeting at Moncloa with the president of the government, Pedro Sánchez. And you already know that Conde Pumpido, just like the president of the Court of Auditors, Enriqueta Chicano, is a key piece in the workings of that judicial scheme. What does Pedro Sánchez have to keep governing and stay in power? Well, the president, attention of the Constitutional Court, Candido Conde Pumpido, wants to regulate the right to strike to prepare the streets. And the president of the government, Pedro Sánchez, loses power. A month ago, the full Constitutional Court approved the admission for processing of 2 appeals filed against a ruling by the Administrative Litigation Chamber of the Supreme Court regarding the establishment of minimum services during a strike by Ryanair airline staff. The conflict centered on determining whether companies retain the authority to set certain aspects related to minimum services when a strike is called, following the limits set in the resolution. Well, the sources from the Constitutional Court we've consulted claim that Candido Conde Pumpido now wants to regulate the right to strike from the Court of Guarantees, modifying the Constitution and ignoring the role of Parliament. The right to strike is a fundamental right recognized in Article 28.2 of the Spanish Constitution. However, almost 50 years later, there is still no organic law that develops it, and therefore it is governed in a supplementary and provisional way by a pre-constitutional royal decree law from 1977. The Constitutional Court says it is not responsible for creating laws or filling gaps left by legislators. The leftist bloc of the Constitutional Court, led by Conde Pumpido, wants to drag the Magna Carta into social reality without respecting the established procedure to amend the Constitution itself. In fact, to carry out a reform, it is necessary for it to be approved by a qualified majority of 3/5 in the full Congress and Senate. Once approved by the legislative chambers, the reform is subject to a mandatory referendum if requested by 1/10 of the members of either chamber. They tell us that we are witnessing a new version of despotism, enlightened from the Tribunal Constitucional. It is undemocratic and insulting. They are trying to impose a vision of what democracy should be like from one political side. Without the consensus that was used to draft the Constitution, the magistrates of the leftist bloc believe they are eternal. Sensitive issues should be changed with a broad social and political majority. But it doesn't stop there, because the same sources we've consulted say that Conde Pumpido intends to regulate the right to strike, for 2 main reasons. First, to satisfy his Mexican delusions, and second, to prepare the streets in case of a possible electoral shift that would make Pedro Sánchez lose power and allow the PP and Vox to govern. This way, we're told, the unions would have more power to demonstrate and call strikes and protests against the future right-wing government in Spain. This is all classic. You already know that the unions stay quiet while the Socialist Party and the left are in power. In fact, they protest against regional governments of the PP, but against the national government, nothing, zero. However, when the right is in power, they take to the streets. And what they want to do with this issue from the Constitutional Court is to give more power to the unions. So that if Pedro Sánchez loses the next elections and there's a political shift and the right governs in Spain, then they can set the streets on fire. The president of the Constitutional Court tells us that, in addition, he used his casting vote to get both appeals admitted for consideration, when there were 6 votes against admitting them and 5 in favor. That is, these 2 appeals against those minimum strike services at Ryanair reached the full court, and at the time of the vote, before Conde Pumpido spoke, 6 judges were against admitting it for processing while 5 were in favor. Okay, and that's when Candido Conde Pumpido arrives. He ties the vote 6-6 and then uses his casting vote so that admitting it for processing wins. And that's how he manages to get these 2 appeals admitted for processing, and for him to legislate instead of Parliament and modify the Constitution, bypassing the mechanisms already established to amend the Constitution and develop that right to strike. Conde Pumpido always had more. He had stated in the plenary sessions up to that point that he would never use his casting vote as president, and that he would vote with the majority. However, in this case, he didn't do that. You know, it's like Groucho Marx said, I have principles, and if you don't like them, well, I have others. They remind us that this procedure had no constitutional significance, and that the appealed ruling had strictly respected the already established doctrine. And we're simply going to recall some highlights of what those previous Supreme Court rulings said, which are the ones that have been appealed to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional Court has admitted those appeals for processing. The Administrative Litigation Chamber of the Supreme Court previously ruled on the appeals regarding the cited right to strike, which belonged to the company. The exact compliance and execution of the essential services set by the administration so that the workforce is limited to only what is strictly necessary to comply with what is established in the administrative resolution. Since it is the one who knows the structure of the workforce to address this conflict, for this reason, the Supreme Court considered that it was sufficiently justified. A resolution that sets the essential public services of the community and leaves them in the hands of the airline company. The determination of the workforce that must provide them as a consequence of its management and organizational powers over the staff. Well, this is the exclusive information that we reveal in precautionary measures, and I, please, would like to make an appeal to the opposition, please, to the Partido Popular, to Vox. While you are fighting among yourselves, arguing, trying to see who is tougher, etc., well, we have the political and judicial left doing harm. Please focus on fighting Pedro Sánchez and not on fighting among yourselves. Just look at how serious what I'm telling you is. They're already setting things up from the Constitutional Court in case Pedro Sánchez loses power, which we'll see if he does in the next elections. Well, they're already setting things up for you so that there will be a very broad right to strike, and this will allow the streets to be set on fire when you govern, if you ever get to govern. So please, I'm making an appeal from this channel, please, to the opposition in this country. If you want to overthrow Sánchez, focus on overthrowing Sánchez and not on arguing and fighting among yourselves. Because in the meantime, some are already preparing the ground to regain power, if they ever lose it someday. Anyway, we will not stop filing injunctions against any move that takes place at the institutional level in all these courts, some judicial, others not. But anyway, they're cooperating, they're being manipulated by those in power, by Pedro Sánchez's government, so that Sánchez can stay in power forever. That's it for this edition of Injunctions. I hope you enjoyed the video, this information I've revealed to you, and of course you already know that you can keep supporting and cooperating with the channel if you become members. Like the chosen ones for less than €3 a month or the Supremes for less than €7 a month. You can also contribute via Bizum, as you already know, at 6,275,563 76,275,563.70. And of course, keep in mind that I always read your comments, which are always very welcome, as long as they are, of course, constructive comments. Constructive criticism is always taken into account. And you already know that you can also give your likes, your thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. We're already at 126,000 subscribers, which is amazing. And you can also share the videos with your family, friends, or co-workers. With all those who deny, who are denialists of all this institutional corruption of Sanchism. The most important thing, as I always tell you, is that this information reaches everyone because information is power. See you soon.